buying land from prison, a Septuagint, and turning loose them slaves. All that today on an episode of the Bible and 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Jeremiah chapter 32 through 34. Tomorrow we're going through Jeremiah chapter 35 through 37. So let's get to it. In chapter 32, here's where we find ourselves. We find Jeremiah in prison. He is locked up in the slammer. To be exact, he is in the guard's courtyard. All right, but this chapter, it kind of promises a bright future. It was given during one of Judah's darkest moments in 588 BC, actually. And as I said, Jeremiah was locked up in prison in the 10th year of King Zedekiah of Judah and the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. So you get over into verse 7, and Jeremiah was given this symbolic evidence for the hope that he had just preached about Israel's future. His cousin, Hanamel, would offer him the right of redemption, and that is basically the opportunity for the family property in his hometown to be redeemed by him. In other words, he could pay money and buy this land back to his family, and he would have that right. We actually read about that legal precedent for that in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 25 through 28. And then the prophet actually purchased the land for 17 shekels of silver. Now, this wasn't like 17 coins of silver or anything. A shekel was actually an amount of weight at that point. It refers to the weight of the silver itself, because back then coins were not used until the Persian period in the 7th century BC. Monetary values were set by weighing ingots of precious metals instead. Silver was one of the chief forms of payment of the time because it wasn't as expensive as gold. You could carry it around easy, but it was still pretty, worth a good bit. So we get into verses 13 through 14 here. They actually mentioned that earthen storage jar that was used to store the Dead Sea Scrolls in. The same storage jar, earthen storage jar that Jeremiah was going to use, was the exact same as the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's where they were found, in those broken jars. Verse 15, Jeremiah actually purchased the field at Anathoth, which symbolized Israel's future restoration to the land. So that's really the point of this story, is that future restoration of land. But it's still just kind of bewildering to me. Right after this, Jeremiah prays, and he prays to God. And one of the phrases that he said is here on your screen. Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. This is a lot of truth here. Only twice in the book, though, of Jeremiah does Jeremiah actually is he actually recorded praying. So this was a very important thing. Here in chapter 42, we will read later in verse 4, he prays. But in this prayer, the prophet declared that nothing is too difficult for God. And he's going to find out that that is true. Verses 23 through 25, again, buying a field just seemed completely absurd in light of the current circumstances. So here you are in prison. You can't even go to this land to buy it. You had to have people bring these papers and to sign off on all this stuff to prison where you were to get this transaction completed. And not only that, he's already prophesied that Babylon is going to take over all this land anyway. So even if he buys it, it's all going to all taken away. Nebuchadnezzar is going to snatch it all. So why would you even bother buying this land? Well, we'll find out later. We get to the very last verses of this chapter, and they return to Jeremiah's purchase of the field in Anathoth. This was a sure sign that the fields in Judah would once again belong to the Hebrews in the future. So this was his confidence that in the future, this land was going to belong to him. And when God divvies that land back out, that's the land that he would own. So of course he would get it. This would include all the geographical areas in Israel, from Benjamin, where Jeremiah's purchase was made, to Jerusalem, Judah's cities, and all the way south to Negev. So all of this. We get to chapter 33, and guess what? Yep, he is still in prison. He's still there. Still locked up in the slammer. And we get to section 14 through 26. And I found this to be really interesting, that this entire half of a chapter was not in the LXX, or as we call it, the Septuagint. You can look that up. I'm going to actually put a link to another video in the description of this video, and it's to a video that explains what the Septuagint is. Well, it sounds like it's a thing, but it's actually a multitude of things, and it'll kind of explain it to you. It's like the Greek Bible, but not really the Greek Bible. It's like the earlier writings that were in Greek that they would, or the Hebrew that they would translate to, the Hebrew to, from, not to, excuse me. Verse 16 here, the name "the Lord is our righteousness" was formerly a name applied to the Messiah. Remember that? We just read about that. And in this verse, it's also applied to Jerusalem. So I found it interesting that even though these verses were left out of the Septuagint, typically when you find that, a lot of that stuff was messianic that was left out. So that kind of gives you a little thing to think about there. Verses 17 and 18, those verses don't literally promise a constant presence of a Davidic king and a Levitical priesthood, because history shows that just did not happen. David's line did not remain on the throne throughout eternity. He didn't. Rather, it means that there will be no cessation of David's dynasty or of the office of the priesthood. And Jesus actually fulfills both of those roles as the office of king and the priest. And we read about that in Psalm 110, verse 4. Christ's priesthood does not follow Levi's line, but he follows the line of Melchizedek, the priest of Salem. And then we're going to move on to chapter 34. Be sure you watch that video about the Septuagint. It was super interesting to me. Jeremiah chapter 34, the fate of Jerusalem. Right, so these are Jeremiah's words to King Zedekiah. Verses 2 and 3 here, the fate of Jerusalem and the king Zedekiah is foretold. Zedekiah would meet the Babylonian king eye to eye and speak face to face with him. There, his eyes would be put out after he was forced to watch the execution of his son. We're going to read about that in chapter 39, verses 5 through 7, and chapter 52, verses 8 through 11 as well, if you want to take a sneak peek at those readings. Now, Zedekiah would not be killed, though. He would actually die in Babylon and have a burning ceremony, just like the funeral fire at other royal funerals. We saw one of those in 2 Chronicles chapter 16 and also chapter 21. But this ceremony was not necessarily a cremation ceremony of sorts. It was mostly a ceremony that involved burning spices on the coffins, but not necessarily burning the entire body up. So there you have that. As we move through chapter 34, verses 8 through 10, this is the motivation for King Zedekiah issuing a covenant or a proclamation or an emancipation. Ever heard that word before? Emancipation? Maybe the Emancipation Proclamation. That's interesting. That all male and female Hebrew slaves should be set free. Now, this is the motivation for him doing that. It's not really given here. It doesn't say, but it seems to have come just before the temporary lifting of Nebuchadnezzar's siege against Jerusalem in late spring or early summer of 588 BC due to a rumor of the approach of the Egyptian army. So, when the siege was lifted, the people abandoned their panic-inspired piety, with the result that slave owners repudiated their solemn oath to God in violation of the provisions in Exodus chapter 21, verse 2 through 6, and Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18, thus profaning God's name. So, clearly, at this point, when I look back at history, there's so many times where when there was slavery going on here in America, where people tried to say that nowhere in the Bible is slavery referred to as a bad thing. Well, not directly, but indirectly right here, it kind of proves to me that God doesn't necessarily think that slavery is a good thing, because clearly he made a promise to set these slaves free, and then he went back on his word here and put them back into slavery. That was a bad thing that triggered God's wrath again on them. So God would take Judah's revoked proclamation of emancipation here and make his own proclamation. Judah would experience freedom from his protection, thus falling to the sword, to the plague, and to famine. Bum, bum, bum. So, the moral of this story is set them people free. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button, subscribe button, of course, click the little jingle bell so you get notified the next time I upload a video. And also hit that little boxing glove and go rumble with me on Rumble, rumble.com. And I am Preacher's Husband on rumble.com. I will see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with Preacher's Husband. See you then.